The stove had gone cold hours ago, but he still sat at the table, turning a tin cup slowly between his hands like it might tell him what to do next. Outside, frost crept along the window edges, sealing the place in silence he never bothered to break. A knock came, not loud, just steady. He didn't answer. The door opened anyway. She stood there, dressed dark with soot that hadn't washed out, eyes hollow but upright. "I'll work," she said, "just until winter passes." He glanced once at the empty chairs, then back at her, because letting her stay meant the quiet wouldn't stay buried either. Before we ride deeper into this tale, subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another journey through the dust, danger, and legends of the Wild West. Now, back to the trail. The cup made a faint scrape each time it turned against the wood, a slow, steady sound that filled the space where voices used to live. Caleb let it turn again, then stopped it with his palm, as if the motion had gone on longer than it should. The fire had died to ash, and he hadn't bothered to stir it back. Outside, the yard lay stiff under frost. The horses shifted in the far pen, waiting for feed that would come at the same hour it always did. Nothing on the ranch ever missed its time. He saw to that. He rose, pulled on his coat, and stepped into the pale morning. The air bit sharp enough to wake a man proper, though it never seemed to reach far enough in. He worked through the motions, grain measured, water hauled, a loose board hammered back into place along the corral. Each task finished clean, without pause, without thought. By mid-morning, a wagon creaked up the road. His brother Daniel climbed down stiffly, stamping warmth back into his boots. "You keep this place running like a clock," Daniel said, glancing around, "but it don't look much lived in." Caleb handed him a sack without answering. Daniel took it, then lowered his voice. "Town's holding a supper tonight. Wouldn't hurt to show your face." "It would," Caleb said, not unkindly. Daniel let out a breath that turned white in the air. "Suit yourself, just ain't meant to stay this quiet forever." Caleb turned back to the pen before the words could settle anywhere. By the time the light faded, the house had returned to its usual stillness. He lit the lamp, ate what little he'd set aside, and left the second place at the table untouched. He didn't look at it. He never did. The knock came again that evening, the same steady sound from before, as if it had been waiting all day to finish what it started. He opened the door this time. She stood on the threshold, thinner than he'd first taken her for, the soot on her dress darker in the lamplight. Her hands were bare, red from the cold, but she held them still. "You didn't answer before," she said quietly, "so I came back." "You've got nowhere better to be?" he asked. "No," she met his eyes without flinching, "but I can work, I won't be in your way." He looked past her into the dark road. No wagon, no horse, nothing but the stretch of frozen ground behind her. "What kind of work?" he said. "Whatever needs doing." A pause, then softer, "I've kept a house before." The words hung there, carrying more than they said. Caleb stepped aside, not quite an invitation, not quite a refusal. She took it for what it was and crossed the threshold, careful not to brush against anything as if the place might reject her for it. "Room's small," he said, leading her down the narrow hall. "Used for storage. You can have it till winter breaks." "That's all I'm asking." He set a lantern on the table inside and left her there, but not before noticing the way she stood, tired, yes, but steady, as if she'd decided something long before she reached his door. The next morning, he woke to a smell that didn't belong to the house. Something warm, something cooked. He found her at the stove, sleeves rolled, moving with care through a space she didn't yet know. A pan sat over a newly coaxed fire, and for the first time in a long while, the room held more than cold air. "I used what I found," she said, not turning. "I'll replace it once I earn enough." He leaned against the doorframe, watching the way she worked, quiet, efficient, but not empty. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know." She glanced back just once, "but I'd rather." He didn't answer right away. The house felt different with the fire going, with someone else moving through it, not louder, just less hollow. "Rules," he said finally. "You keep to your space, I keep to mine. Work gets done, and when the thaw comes, you move on." She nodded, as if she'd expected nothing else. "That's fair." Caleb looked at the table, at the place she'd set without asking, opposite his own. He didn't tell her to move it, because for the first time, the silence didn't feel like something he could control. By the third morning, Caleb had learned two things about Eliza Wren. The first was that she rose before daylight, moving so quietly he never heard her door open. The second was that she could unsettle an orderly room without seeming to touch a thing. He came in from the barn with cold stiff in his shoulders and found his kitchen changed in ways he couldn't name at once. His coat, which he always left on the same peg, hung from another. His gloves had been set by the stove to dry. The cracked blue plate he used for every meal had been replaced by a plain white one pulled from the back shelf where he had not looked in years. He stood in the doorway long enough for her to notice. "I washed the others," she said, as if that explained everything. It didn't need doing. She glanced toward the shelf. It looked like it had. There was no sharpness in the remark. That made it harder to answer. Caleb set down the feed pail and stepped to the basin to wash his hands. "You don't know where things belong yet," he said. "No," she replied, folding a cloth with careful edges, "but I can learn." He might have said more if she had sounded apologetic. Instead, she sounded matter-of-fact, as though learning a man's habits was no harder than learning a new stove. That left him with nowhere useful to put his irritation. Breakfast was oat cakes and weak coffee, better than what he usually made for himself, and somehow more aggravating because of it. She did not sit while he ate. She moved through the room with sleeves pinned back, sorting a basket of mending she had found in a trunk beside the pantry. "That's not necessary either," he said. "It is if you intend to keep wearing shirts with cuffs hanging loose." He looked down at one wrist and found she was right. Later that day he discovered she had stacked his tools by use instead of by size, brought in fresh water before he asked, and scrubbed the soot from the lamp glass so clean the flame seemed brighter than before. Every change was practical. Every change felt like a hand laid over a life he had kept carefully untouched. By supper, the strain between them had settled into something quiet and awkward, like two travelers forced to share a bench in a crowded depot. "You don't have to stand every time I enter a room," Caleb said when he found her half rising from her chair. "I wasn't standing for you," she said. "I thought the biscuits were burning." He looked toward the stove. "They are." "No," she said, sitting again. "They are." For 1 second, not long enough to call it amusement, the corner of her mouth moved. Caleb noticed it and resented that he had. The days that followed did not smooth them together so much as wear down the roughest edges. She had a way of asking questions that made plain what she did not know and what she had no shame in learning. How much grain per horse in deeper cold? Which fence line drifted over first when the weather turned? Why he kept old nails sorted in tobacco tins by size. Caleb answered because it was simpler than not answering. Sometimes his replies were short enough to be nothing more than a nod. She took them as if they were full explanations. There were misunderstandings too. She salted the stew like town cooking, and he ate 2 bites before setting down his spoon. "Something wrong?" she asked. "It tastes like the Missouri River." She blinked, then looked stricken. "Too much." "A little." She took the pot from the stove at once. "I'll fix it." He watched her tip in potatoes and water, working with a calm that surprised him. "No need, I've eaten worse." "That is not encouragement," she said. He nearly answered, then stopped. Her tone had not been offended, it had been dry. By the time she set the bowl down again, the taste had softened, and so had something in the room. A week later she tried to help in the yard, carrying split wood in her apron, and slipped on the hard-packed path beside the shed. Caleb reached her in 2 strides, more from habit than thought, and found her sitting in the snow with a look of offended dignity that sat oddly on a woman dusted white from hem to shoulders. "I had it," she said before he could speak. "You're on the ground." I'm aware. He offered his hand. She stared at it a moment, then took it and rose. Snow clung to her sleeve. Without thinking, he brushed it away. She went still. So did he. Path slick there, he said, stepping back. So I've learned. But when he carried the wood in himself, he heard a sound behind him that took a moment to place. She was laughing at herself, quietly, not to make a show of it. The sound followed him all the way to the door. Not every day brought something that light. Some were only work. He mended harness. She patched torn curtains, aired blankets, and turned the little room at the back of the house into something less temporary by the simple act of folding her things neatly and setting a sprig of cedar in a chipped cup on the sill. She never pushed farther than he allowed, yet the evidence of her spread anyway, small and unhurried. Fresh biscuits wrapped in a cloth. A sweep of pine sent after floors were scrubbed. A second lamp lit in the front room on stormy evenings, as if someone expected it to be used. At first, Caleb moved through these changes warily, like a man crossing creek ice in spring. Then he began to notice what was absent when she stepped out: the low hum she made while baking, the shift of chair legs across the floor, the way her presence kept the house from falling silent too early in the day. She did not remain tucked away at the ranch either. On a trip into town for flour and lamp oil, Mrs. Penny from the general store caught sight of the seam at Caleb's shoulder and said, "If you keep buying shirts built for fence posts, that stitching will never hold." Eliza, standing beside him with a list in hand, said, "I can mend it proper if you've thread strong enough." Mrs. Penny looked from one to the other with open interest. "I have thread and 3 aprons that need hems if you're taking in work." Eliza's face changed at once, not bright exactly, but intent, alive. "I could do that." "Could you now?" Mrs. Penny said. "Bring them back by Friday." Caleb would have refused on her behalf a month earlier, if only to keep the world from making claims on his roof. But Eliza was already discussing fabric weights and needle sizes with a steadiness that made interruption feel foolish. So he stood by the molasses barrel and waited, while women made plans around him as if he were a hitching post. By Friday, the aprons were hemmed square, and the stitches so fine Mrs. Penny ran a thumb along one edge twice before paying. "Got a widow over on Birch Street needing black dresses altered," she said. "And Mr. Tate wants his cuffs fixed if your hands don't object to grumbling." "My hands don't object," Eliza said. "Mr. Tate does enough grumbling for both." That earned a laugh from the storekeeper and unexpectedly a snort from Caleb. He turned it into a cough at once, but both women heard. Mrs. Penny's eyes narrowed in satisfaction. Eliza looked at him, surprised first, then pleased in a way she tried not to show. Work began to come in bits after that. Sewing, mending, a church cloth in need of repair after a careless candle burn. She used the small table by the window in the afternoons, head bent, fingers quick and exact. Coins gathered slowly in a blue jar by the mantel. She never spoke much of the money, but Caleb noticed she bought her own pins the next time they went to town, then a bar of soap scented faintly with lavender. Neither thing cost much. Both seemed to matter. One Saturday, Daniel arrived and found the front room occupied by folded garments, spools of thread, and Eliza with a measuring tape round her neck. He stopped on the threshold. "Well now." Eliza looked up from her work. "Good morning, Daniel." His gaze swept the room, then landed on Caleb. "Looks like civilization tracked mud onto the place while I wasn't looking." Caleb took the sack of oats from his brother's hands. "You want coffee or just trouble?" "Depends, which one's fresher?" Eliza hid a smile by looking down. Daniel did not miss it. He sat at the table, accepted a cup, and watched the two of them move around the kitchen as if he had stumbled onto some curious theater. When Eliza stepped out to fetch more wood, he leaned back and said quietly, "You're answering in whole sentences now." Caleb kept his eyes on the kettle. "I always could." "That ain't what I said." The older brother's tone carried no mockery, only a gentleness that Caleb mistrusted more than teasing. He set the kettle down with more force than needed. "She's here for winter, nothing more." Daniel drank his coffee, and the snow's only weather. Caleb said nothing, but long after Daniel left, the remark lingered. Winter deepened, the creek froze over in the shallows, the nights sharpened. Yet inside the house, things eased into patterns that belonged to both of them. He fed the horses before dawn. She had coffee ready when he came in. He split kindling. She stacked it near the stove with the bark turned inward so the floor stayed clean. He checked the roof after a hard snow. She thawed his gloves near the fire and pretended not to notice when he reached for them before sitting down. Some evenings they spoke little at all. Those became the easiest. She sewed by lamplight while he mended tack or sharpened a blade, both of them held in the same circle of gold. Other evenings, a question opened into more. "What was it like?" she asked once, not looking up from the shirt she was darning, "before all this country settled so thick?" "My father said there were fewer fences and more fools." She smiled. "That sounds like a fond memory." It sounded like complaint at the time. "And now?" He considered. "Now it sounds expensive." That laugh came easier than the one in the yard. Not loud, just warm enough to make the room feel smaller in a good way. Another night she burnt the first batch of biscuits while asking if horses minded music. "Music," Caleb said. "I used to play some before." The word fell between them and was left there. He rose, took the blackened pan from the stove, and set it by the sink. "Horses mind shouting," he said. "Music depends who's playing." She looked up. "That is an evasive answer." "It is a careful one." She laughed again, then covered her face a moment with the heel of her hand when she saw the biscuits. "Well, no horse will be tested tonight." He surprised them both by saying, "The second batch is usually better." For a moment she only stared. Then she nodded once and began again. It was not only the house that altered. In town, people who once nodded to Caleb from a distance now stopped him to ask after Eliza's sewing. Mrs. Penny called her a blessing to frayed linen and half this town's pride. Even Reverend Cole's sister brought over curtains and stayed long enough to praise Eliza's neat hand and invite her to a church quilting circle. "You should go," Caleb said when Eliza mentioned it at supper. She looked up from buttering bread. "I thought you'd rather I didn't." "Why?" "Because you look as though you'd rather most gatherings sink into the earth." He could not deny it. "I said you should go. And if I say I'd like you to come once." He broke his bread apart. "Then I'd say you ask large things in small voices." She did not press. That more than any pleading would have made him think about it after he went to bed. Her place in the town grew by degrees, each one modest, together unmistakable. Children waved when she passed the schoolyard. Mrs. Penny trusted her with the counter while she went to the back room. A widow on Birch Street sent over preserves in thanks for the altered dresses. Eliza accepted all of it with gratitude and an odd kind of caution, as if belonging anywhere still felt borrowed. Caleb saw that too. Once, after a snowy trip back from town, he found her standing at the gatepost, not slumped against it, only resting there, looking toward the road as the last light went down. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded without turning, just thinking how strange it is to be known somewhere again. He stood beside her, not close enough to crowd. "You've earned it." At that she looked at him, really looked, as if the words had caught her unprepared. "So have you," she said. He glanced away first. By late January, the jar on the mantel held enough coins for more than soap and thread. One afternoon he came in to find a new pair of work gloves on the table. He stopped. "What's this?" "You wear through the thumbs too fast." "I didn't ask for gloves." "No," she kept folding a towel. "You also didn't ask for supper the first night. Some needs are plain anyhow." He picked them up. Good leather, lined, better than he would have bought himself. Eliza, you can pay me back by not ruining them in a week. There was no room in her tone for gratitude. That made it easier to accept and harder to forget. After that, he found himself noticing things he had no business noticing. The way she tucked loose hair behind one ear when reading a receipt, the faint crease between her brows while concentrating over a seam, the particular quiet that came over her near sundown, as if some old ache traveled with the light. None of it felt like desire at first. It felt more dangerous than that. It felt like attention. He began bringing in extra wood before storms without being asked. He checked the latch on her window on bitter nights. Once, seeing her hands redden from wash water, he set a tin of salve by her plate and said only, "For the cracking." She looked at the tin, then at him, and thanked him so gently he had to step outside a minute under pretense of checking the horses. The trouble was not that he did not see himself changing. The trouble was that he did. He sat longer at meals now. He answered when spoken to. He listened for her step in the hall and knew the sound of it from the creak of every board. When she went into town without him, the house did not feel peaceful. It felt paused. That knowledge began to bring with it a strain he had not expected. On certain evenings, when lamplight softened the room and her voice carried low across the table, guilt rose swift and unreasonable, like a hand closing around his throat. Memory came with it, not in sharp pictures but in absences. Another woman once moved through a kitchen with ease. Another laugh had once lived under his roof. Another life had been buried because the world took what it wanted and gave back silence. So when warmth crept in, fear was never far behind. One night Eliza fell asleep in the chair with a piece of mending in her lap, head tilted toward the fire. Caleb looked up from the harness strap in his hands and saw her there, worn out from work and trustful enough to sleep in his house as if it was safe. For a long while he did nothing. Then he rose, took the blanket from the settee and laid it over her shoulders. She stirred only enough to draw it closer. Caleb stood in the glow of the stove and watched her settle. The room around her, the lamp, the folded cloths, the gloves on the peg, the second cup drying by the basin, no longer resembled the hard, preserved life he had meant to keep. It looked, he had to admit, like the beginning of something. And that frightened him enough that, before dawn, he was already out in the cold, working longer than the chores required, trying to tire his hands enough that his heart might remember how to stay still. By February the thaw had not yet come, but the days had begun to loosen around the edges. Snow still held in the shaded places, packed hard beside the fence lines and under the wagon, yet the roof gave off a slow drip by noon, and the yard turned slick where sunlight lingered. It was the kind of weather that made a man think spring might exist somewhere beyond sight, though not yet within reach. Caleb noticed, with growing unease, that he had started measuring the day by things that were not chores. The first was the sound of Eliza at the stove in the morning, moving quietly but not invisibly, the faint knock of a spoon against a bowl, the crackle of fire coaxed awake before dawn had fully opened. The second was the hour she sat by the window in the afternoon with her sewing basket at her feet, head bent, light catching now and then on the loose strands of hair she never seemed to notice had come free. The third was the look the house took on when evening settled and both lamps were lit, one in the kitchen and one in the front room, as if the place no longer meant to pretend it was empty. He disliked knowing these things, not because they were unpleasant, quite the opposite. That was what made them dangerous. One afternoon he came in from repairing a loose hinge on the stock shed and found Eliza standing on a chair in the pantry, reaching for a tin set too far back on the upper shelf. The chair had one short leg. It wobbled if a man so much as breathed near it. Caleb saw it tip before she did. "Hold still," he said sharply. She startled, turned, and the chair shifted under her. He was across the floor in a moment, catching the back of the chair with one hand and her waist with the other. The tin slipped from her fingers and clattered against the floor, but neither of them looked at it. For an instant she was suspended there between falling and being steadied, her breath close enough that he felt it against his cheek. One hand had gone to his shoulder without her seeming to know it. The other gripped the shelf beside her. He could feel the slight tremor that ran through her from surprise. He could also feel the shape of her through the layers of wool and cotton, the undeniable warmth of a living body trusting his hands not to let go. "Caleb," she said, though it came out more like a breath than a word. He set the chair square, then lifted her down too quickly, as if speed alone might undo what had happened. "That thing ought to be chopped for kindling," he muttered. Her face had gone still in that careful way it did when she was feeling more than she wanted shown. "You could have just said it was unsteady." "I did. After." He stepped back at once. "You shouldn't climb if I'm not here." The moment the words were out, he heard how they sounded. Too close to care, too close to claim. She heard it too. Her eyes shifted, not hurt exactly, but cautious. "I have managed my own safety before you," she said. "I know that." "Do you?" He bent to pick up the fallen tin. It had burst open. Dried beans skittered across the boards. "It isn't a question of ability." "No," she said after a pause. "I suppose it is." He knew she wanted him to say more. He knew, too, that he had no safe words to offer. So he crouched on the floor, gathering beans one by one, while she took up the broom and swept the rest into her apron without another word. The silence that followed was not the old silence he had once worn like a coat. This one had shape to it, weight. It lingered at supper and moved with them through the evening. When she handed him his coffee, her fingers brushed his only by accident, yet both of them seemed to feel it for longer than the contact deserved. 2 days later, the weather turned mean again. A hard wind came down out of the north, bringing needles of sleet that struck the house in angry little bursts. Caleb went out after sundown because the bay mare had foaled early once before and did not fare well in sharp cold. By the time he came back from the barn, his hat brim was slick with ice and his coat collar stiff. Eliza met him at the door with a lamp in one hand and a towel in the other. "You're frozen through," she said. "I'm not." "Then you're the first man in Wyoming territory whose sleeves jingle." He might have answered, but she was already reaching for his coat buttons. He stood still out of surprise more than willingness. Her hands worked quickly, not timid, not bold either, simply practical, as if she had long since decided that fussing over male pride was a poor use of time. "Sit," she said, nodding toward the chair by the stove. He sat. She draped the towel over his shoulders and rubbed the wet from his hair with brisk, efficient movements. It should have been ridiculous. A grown man, broad-shouldered and weathered, sitting still while a woman dabbed sleet from his brow like a mother with a stubborn child. Yet there was nothing childish in the way his breath slowed beneath her hands. "You'll blister your scalp," he said, because he had to say something. "Then I'll be remembered as the widow who murdered a rancher by kindness." A laugh escaped him before he could stop it. Not much. Just a low, startled sound, but enough to make her hands pause. She looked down at him, he looked up at her. The stove gave a small pop behind them. Something passed between them then, not spoken, not touched, but plain enough to feel. The towel had slipped partly from her grasp. One end still rested against the side of his neck. Her face, usually guarded by some measure of politeness or calm purpose, had gone open in the lamplight. There was grief in it still, and caution, but also something warmer and infinitely more perilous. Caleb rose too abruptly, knocking the chair leg against the floor. "That's enough," he said. Her hand dropped at once. "I was only helping." "I know." He took his coat from the peg and hung it with care he did not feel. When he turned again, she had set the towel over the rail and stepped back, giving him more room than the kitchen required. Neither of them mentioned it, but the charge of it lingered long after the wind had died. From then on, Caleb became a less reliable version of himself. He forgot a sack of feed open by the door and found the chickens scratching in it come morning. He left the hammer on the porch after repairing a loose step, and it lay there all night under frost. Twice he answered Daniel with, "What?" Because he had not heard a word the man said. "You look like a fella trying to saddle 2 horses with one mind." his brother remarked, while helping mend a stretch of fence that late snow had dragged low. Caleb drove the staple in too deep and had to pry it loose again. "You came to work or observe?" "Mostly observe, work's just the excuse." Daniel leaned on the post, studying him with that same maddening patience older brothers mistook for wisdom. "You're worn thin." "I'm busy." "Busy ain't the same as uneasy." Caleb straightened. The field beyond them lay pale and damp, the grass still winter-burnt. Somewhere out near the creek a crow called once and fell quiet. Daniel went on more gently, "You don't have to tell me anything, but don't lie to yourself and call it peace." Caleb looked away. "There's nothing to tell." Daniel nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "All right, then tell me this. When was the last time you sat at your own supper table without thinking who'd be on the other side of it?" Caleb did not answer. His brother pressed the point no farther. He only bent for another staple and said, "That's what I thought." The trouble grew worse after that, not because Daniel had spoken, but because he had spoken truly. Caleb had begun to anticipate Eliza without permission from himself. The sound of her laugh in town, the sight of her shawl hanging by the door, the habit she had of pushing her sleeve back with the heel of her wrist when her hands were full. These things found him whether he looked for them or not, and with them came the old guilt, sharpened now into something more specific. Not only grief for what had been lost, but shame that warmth could still reach him at all. His wife, Anna, had once filled a room without effort. She had sung badly while kneading bread and insisted the baby favored him when all the town said otherwise. Their boy had lived only 6 winters. The fever took him in 3 days. Anna lasted another year after that, thinner in spirit each month, until a second illness finished what sorrow had begun. Caleb had buried both beneath a cottonwood rise east of the pasture and come home to a house that still carried their things. For months after, he had moved among them like a trespasser. For years after, he had lived by stripping the place down to function, not because function comforted him, because it demanded less. Now Eliza stood at his stove and laughed in his kitchen and bought soap with her own earnings and mended the broken hems of half the county, and somehow none of it felt like intrusion anymore. That was the betrayal, or so he told himself. He started leaving before daylight and staying out long after the animals were fed. If a fence could be checked twice, he checked it 3 times. If a bridle needed oiling next week, he oiled it now. He took his dinner in the barn once, then again, though the cold bread sat heavy and joyless in his hand. He told himself distance was fairness. The thaw would come, she would move on. Better to remind them both of the terms before either forgot. Eliza, for her part, did not plead. That made the whole business worse. She simply adjusted. She left his plate covered near the stove when he came in late. She spoke when needed and no more. If hurt showed at all, it showed only in how careful she became, as if every word now required weighing. The ease that had slowly risen between them did not vanish. It folded inward. One evening he found her in the front room sorting finished sewing into neat stacks for delivery. A child's coat lay across her lap, patched at both elbows. The lamplight made her look tired. "You've got too much work," he said. She kept stitching. "I'm grateful for that." "That's not what I mean." At this she stopped and raised her eyes. "Then perhaps you ought to mean what you say." He stood there with no answer fit for either of them. After a moment, she returned to the coat. "Mrs. Penny says Mr. Tate's sister wants help with curtains next week. I may spend a few afternoons in town." "That so?" "Yes." He nodded as though the news did not matter. But that night the house felt stripped in advance. The distance held through the next week. The weather softened slightly, the roof dripped more steadily by midday, and patches of earth showed black beside the well. Eliza went into town twice on her own, once riding in with Mrs. Penny's husband on the supply wagon, once walking back with a widow from Birch Street after the quilting circle. Each time, Caleb found himself listening for her return, then resenting the relief when he heard it. At church on Sunday, he had not meant to go, yet somehow found himself there after Eliza asked nothing at all. Reverend Cole preached on endurance in a world where losses outnumbered explanations. Caleb heard none of it clearly. He sat stiff-backed beside Daniel while Eliza, 2 pews ahead, kept her eyes lowered through the hymn. When the service ended, the townsfolk lingered in the yard, breath smoking in the cold, while children kicked at old snowbanks. Mrs. Penny buttoned her coat and said to Eliza, "You'll still come Tuesday for the dress fittings." "I will. And Wednesday with the curtain lengths. If weather holds." "Good, you've become harder to borrow than the marshal's horse." Eliza smiled politely. Caleb should have taken satisfaction in that. She was standing on her own now, exactly as a decent man ought to wish. Instead, he felt a strange bleakness, as if the ground under his arrangement were quietly disappearing. Daniel, watching him watch her, said under his breath, "You can still choose not to be a fool." Caleb kept his gaze on the church steps. "I've chosen other things before, never improved matters." His brother's face altered, the teasing went out of it. "Anna's gone, Cal." The name struck with the force of a shove. "I'm aware." "No," Daniel said quietly, "you remember, that's not the same as living aware." Caleb stepped away before the talk could go any further. He did not stop until he reached the barn behind the church, where townsfolk kept horses tied during service. The smell of hay and leather closed around him, familiar and blunt. He stood in the half-dark with one hand braced on a stall post and let the anger burn through until he realized it was not anger at Daniel. It was grief, old and unspent, roused because someone had dared to put love and memory in the same room. When he came back out, Eliza was waiting near the wagon shed, shawl gathered close at her throat. "You left quickly," she said. "I needed air." "There was plenty of that where we stood." He would have smiled another time. Today he could not. "I'm sorry." She studied him a moment, then nodded toward the road. "Walk home with me." He did. Neither spoke much. Their boots sank in the wet ruts where snow had softened. Halfway back, a flock of starlings rose suddenly from the fence line and turned in one dark rush against the sky. Eliza paused to watch them. "My girls used to chase birds every chance they got," she said, not looking at him, "as if one day they might catch the whole flock and keep it in their apron." The words were plain, but he heard the ache beneath them. She had not spoken of the fire in any detail. He had not asked. Some griefs announced themselves without invitation, others waited to see if there was room. "What were their names?" he asked. She answered at once, as though she had been carrying them at the edge of speech. "Martha and June." He nodded. "Martha was solemn," she went on softly. June smiled at anything that moved. "My husband said the Lord had divided all the seriousness into one child and all the foolishness into the other." This time Caleb did smile faintly. Eliza swallowed. "I still hear them some mornings, not as voices exactly, more like the shape of them in a room." He knew that feeling too well. He could have said so. Instead he said, "I know." That single admission seemed to ease something in her. They walked the rest of the way in a quiet less strained than the ones before, but whatever peace the road offered did not hold. 3 nights later, a spring storm rolled in without warning, heavy and wet. Snowmelt had already softened the creek bank, and by dusk, the lower pasture lay slick with black water. Caleb went out to move the yearlings to higher ground before the fence washed loose. Rain soaked through his coat within minutes. By the time the animals were secured and the gate roped fast, darkness had come down thick. He returned to the house filthy, drenched, and shaking harder than he cared to admit. Eliza had the stove blazing and a lantern set on the table. She took one look at him and moved forward. "Sit down." "I'm fine, Caleb." There was no point arguing. He dropped into the chair by the stove, boots leaving mud across the boards. She knelt at once to pull them off, and he caught her wrist before she could touch the first one. "Don't." She looked up. Rain still ran from his sleeves onto the floor between them. "You can barely feel your hands." "I said don't." The force of it made her go very still. For a heartbeat, he saw only surprise. Then came something else. Hurt, yes, but deeper than that. Recognition. As if she had finally reached the edge of whatever door he would not open, she rose slowly from her knees. Very well. He let go at once, ashamed before the contact had fully ended. But the shame only fed the pressure already building in him. He stripped off one glove, failed to work the fingers of the other, and suddenly found he could not master so simple a task. Eliza took a step toward him, then stopped herself. That restraint undid him more thoroughly than any comfort might have. He bent forward, elbows on his knees, both hands over his face. At first he thought the shaking came from cold. Then he heard the sound that had escaped him and knew better. It was not loud, not dramatic. Just one raw break in the middle of his breath, like something old had split under strain. The room stayed quiet. After a long moment, Eliza moved, but not to touch him. She set a dry towel on the table within reach. Then she sat in the chair opposite and waited. That more than gentleness brought the rest. Caleb lowered his hands. His eyes burned. He stared at the wet floorboards because looking at her seemed impossible. "I don't know how to do this," he said, the words coming rough. "I don't know how to have any of it and not feel as though I'm standing over grave." No answer came at once. Only the soft hiss of rain against the window and the low breathing of the fire. "When Anna died," he said, and the name itself was nearly enough to stop him, "I thought if I kept the place quiet enough, plain enough, nothing more could be taken. Thought if I never wanted too much again, I'd be left with what remained." He swallowed hard. "Then you came here, and the house changed, and I changed with it. I did not ask you to, but you did." He finally lifted his eyes. Eliza's face had gone wet as well, though she had made no sound. "I know," she said. He shook his head. "No, you don't. I am frightened all the time now." "Of me?" "Of wanting what comes with you." That hurt him to say because it was true in more than one direction. Wanting meant risking. Wanting meant memory not as shelter, but as comparison. Wanting meant admitting he had not been dead, only buried alive. Eliza rose then and crossed to him slowly enough that he could have stopped her. She laid one hand, light as breath, on the table between them rather than on him. "You loved them," she said. "That does not leave because you are still here." He looked at her hand, then at her face. "I buried my husband and my daughters," she said, voice trembling but steady enough to hold. "I carry them. I do not put them down to speak to you. I do not betray them by breathing in this room." The rain beat harder, then softened. Caleb bowed his head. Another tear fell before he could stop it. He did not wipe it away this time. Eliza stayed with him until the shaking eased, then helped him from the wet coat and set a dry blanket over his shoulders as if the world had narrowed to these ordinary, merciful acts. She asked no more of him that night. Yet after that, nothing between them could return to what it had been. The next days passed in a tension so tender it almost hurt. Caleb no longer avoided her, but neither did he speak of what had broken open. Eliza moved through the house with the same care as before, though now it seemed shaped by expectation rather than caution. Their glances lasted a second too long. Their silences no longer hid emptiness. They hid words waiting their turn. Spring was coming. The road would soon clear. Both of them knew it. And because they knew, every shared hour began to feel like the edge of something that could still be lost. By the first week of March, the road had begun to show through, not all at once. Winter never surrendered with that kind of grace. It gave up in patches, black earth beside the well, narrow ribbons of running water along the wagon ruts, the fence posts standing less buried than before. The mornings still carried a hard bite, but by afternoon the roof sang with thaw, and the creek behind the lower pasture moved louder each day, as if something long held still had decided it would not be stopped much longer. Inside the house, the change in season brought with it another sort of reckoning. Eliza had begun putting small things in order, not the ordinary order of sweeping floors or folding linens or setting yeast to rise before dawn. Caleb had grown used to those rhythms. No, this was different. He noticed it first when the blue jar of sewing money disappeared from the mantel and reappeared, emptied and wrapped in cloth, in the basket she kept near her bed. Then he saw the stack of garments for mending grow smaller, each one finished and tied with careful string for delivery. A shawl Mrs. Penny had given her in thanks was folded at the foot of her bed instead of hanging by the door. Even the cedar sprig on the windowsill in her room had been replaced with a dried stem of early willow, as if she had begun preparing herself for a road she had not yet named aloud. Caleb did not ask. The truth was plain enough without asking. Winter was ending. Their arrangement had always been counted in frost and snow. A decent man did not keep a woman by silence if his silence had once promised freedom. Still, he found himself measuring every sign of her leaving as if it were a loss already begun. One evening he came in from the barn later than usual and found the kitchen table spread with small neat piles: thread, needles, dressmaker's chalk, a worn pair of scissors Mrs. Penny had sold her cheap, and a folded paper with figures written in Eliza's tidy hand. She sat bent over it, lips moving faintly as she counted. "What's that?" he asked. She looked up, almost guilty to be caught planning a list. "So I see. For town." He waited. She laid the pencil aside. "Mrs. Penny's sister has a room above the milliner's shop, small but enough for one. She says if I still want it after the mud dries, it can be had for fair rent. And there's steady sewing now. Curtains, hems, morning dresses, boys' jackets, whatever folk tear faster than they can afford to replace." He stood with one hand on the back of a chair, saying nothing. Eliza gave him a small, steady look. "You said when the thaw came, I'd move on." "I remember what I said." Her fingers rested lightly on the edge of the paper. "I remember too." The room went quiet, except for the kettle beginning to murmur on the stove. At last Caleb said, "Do you want the room?" She held his gaze a moment, and in that moment he understood how careful she was being not to ask anything of him he had not offered. "It seems sensible," she said. "Sensible." He nodded because anything else would have required a courage he had not yet found. That night he lay awake listening to the thaw drip from the eaves and thought of the room above the milliner's shop. He pictured its narrow bed, its single basin, its little square of window looking onto town. He imagined Eliza carrying her sewing basket up those stairs, lighting her own lamp, bolting her own door. There was nothing shameful in the image, nothing even sad if measured by ordinary standards. She would be independent, safe, known, a woman making her own way, so why did the thought of it hollow him out? He rose before dawn and went to the barn, though there was no need. He mucked a stall already clean enough, checked hooves by lantern light, and stood so long at the mare's shoulder that the animal turned to nose his sleeve in mild concern. When he finally went back to the house, Eliza was already up, rolling biscuit dough on the floured board. "You're early," she said. "Didn't sleep." She brushed a strand of hair from her brow with the back of her wrist. "Storm in the roof." "No." "Then I'll assume it's a storm elsewhere." He almost smiled, almost, but the smile could not find its way through whatever weight had settled in him. At church the following Sunday, Reverend Coles spoke on the difference between endurance and hiding. Caleb heard every word and wished he had not. Eliza sat beside him that morning because Daniel had taken the far end of the pew and left no room for polite arrangements. During the final hymn, he felt the warmth of her sleeve near his and had to keep his eyes fixed on the worn back of the bench ahead. Afterward, the yard outside the church was full of early spring mud and people glad for one another's company. Children ran where the ground allowed it. Mrs. Penny stood with two other women discussing cloth prices, and Eliza was drawn into the circle almost at once. "You'll be in town before Easter then," Mrs. Penny said. "Good. I've 2 bridesmaids, dresses no one else will touch, and Hiram Cole has worn through both elbows on his Sunday coat again." Eliza smiled. "Then I suppose I'll be well employed." "You suppose right." Caleb stood a little apart with Daniel near the hitching rail. His brother glanced toward the women, then at him. "You look like a man watching someone load up half his house and drive off with the stove." Caleb kept his eyes on the muddy ground. "Mind your own affairs." "I would if you weren't making a public exhibit of mine." Caleb gave him a look. Daniel lowered his voice. "She's leaving because that's what you told her must happen." "I never told her must." "No," Daniel said. "You just made sure she'd never ask otherwise." That landed where it was meant to. Across the yard, Eliza was laughing at something Mrs. Penny had said. The sound traveled clear in the cold, bright air. Caleb realized, with a kind of quiet dread, that the town now knew her as its own. Not as a woman burned out of her life, not as a temporary soul tucked away on his ranch for winter, but as Eliza Wren, dependable with a needle, kind to children, steady in a hard season. If she left his house, she would not vanish. She would go on just fine. It was he who would be left standing in the doorway of the life she had warmed. A week later, she went into town with Mrs. Penny to look at the room above the milliner's shop. Caleb told himself not to wait for her back. He waited anyway. He tried to use the time well. He repaired a trace chain, sharpened the draw knife, cleaned the ash from the stove box. Yet every task was interrupted by the sound he thought he heard: wagon wheels at the road, a footstep on the porch, the latch lifting. Each time it was nothing. By late afternoon, the house had begun to feel less like a home and more like proof of what it had once been without her. When she finally returned, she stepped in carrying a brown paper parcel under one arm and a look on her face he could not read at once. "How is it?" he asked. She set the parcel on the table. "Small." "That can be mended with chairs." "It has only one chair." "That's an easier fix." For a second she laughed, then the laugh faded and she untied her bonnet. "It will do." That was not the same as liking it. Caleb stood motionless by the stove. "Do." "It's a room, Caleb, 4 walls, a roof that doesn't appear to leak, a window." She gave a little shrug, too light for what sat beneath it. "I've had less." He looked at the parcel she had brought. "What's that?" She opened it and showed him a small square of printed calico, pale cream with faded blue flowers. "For curtains," she said. Mrs. Penny thought the place needed cheering. He stared at the cloth, then at her hands folded over it. Suddenly the image of those curtains hanging in some other window, hers, but not in his house, became unbearable. That night at supper he hardly touched his food. Eliza watched him once or twice, then said gently, "You needn't look as though I've announced a hanging." He set down his fork. "Did you say yes to the room?" "I told her I'd take it by the end of the month." The kitchen seemed to tilt slightly. "The end of the month?" "Yes." She reached for her cup, then stopped, perhaps hearing at last what was in his silence. "Caleb." But he had already risen, not in anger. In something worse than anger, fear sharpened too suddenly into motion. "I need air," he said. Outside, the evening was damp and raw. The pasture lay streaked with old snow and dark mud. Caleb crossed to the barn and stood inside the doorway where the smell of hay and leather had once been enough to steady him. It was not enough now. The truth, when it finally came plain, was embarrassingly simple. He loved her. Not because she had saved him, though in some quiet way she had. Not because she made biscuits better than his own, or knew how to stretch a stew, or laughed at the right sort of foolishness. He loved her because she had entered a deadened place and answered it not with pity, not with fear, but with life. She had not tried to erase what came before. She had made room beside it, in his house, in herself, in him, and he had let her believe she must go. The barn door creaked behind him. "You forgot your coat," Daniel said, stepping inside. Caleb turned. "How long have you been on my land?" "Long enough to know when a man's pacing holes through it." He held out the coat. Caleb did not take it. Daniel looked at him more closely then, and his tone changed. "What happened?" "She's taking the room in town." "Is she?" "Yes." "And whose fault is that?" Caleb let out a hard breath. "I know." His brother waited. Caleb pressed a hand to the back of his neck. "I told myself I was being decent, told myself I was giving her freedom, not asking for more than I had any right to ask." Daniel leaned one shoulder against the stall post. "That all may even be true." "It isn't enough." "No." The answer, plain and unmerciful, settled between them. Caleb looked toward the far stall where a shaft of evening light fell across the boards. "I loved Anna." Daniel's face softened. "I know. If I say this now, if I ask Eliza to stay, does that make me faithless? Did loving your boy make you faithless to your father?" Caleb frowned. "Love ain't a loaf, Cal. It doesn't go smaller because more hands are fed." He shut his eyes briefly. Daniel went on, quieter. "Anna was your wife. She was good to you, and you were good to her. Nothing you build now takes that away. All you've done these years is punish yourself for surviving." For a long moment, Caleb could not speak. Then he said, "I'm afraid." "Of course you are. What if I lose this too?" His brother's mouth twitched sadly. "You will lose it for certain if you hand it over without a word." That settled it more than any encouragement could have. Caleb stood straighter, as if some hinge inside him had finally been set right. "When does Mrs. Penny close the store?" he asked. Daniel looked toward the light outside. "Another hour, likely." Caleb took the coat then, jammed his arms into it, and headed for the door. "You might want to wash your face first," Daniel called after him. "Women tend to prefer confessions without stable dust." Caleb did not dignify that with an answer, but he did splash water at the pump before saddling the bay. He found Eliza not at the store, but on the boardwalk outside it, a parcel of thread tucked under her arm, speaking with Mrs. Penny beneath the awning. The older woman saw him first, and with the sharp intuition of her sex, said at once, "Eliza dear, I've just remembered I left the back ledger open," before disappearing indoors with a speed remarkable for her age. Eliza turned. For 1 second neither of them moved. The town street behind her held its ordinary life, wagon creak, voices, the rattle of harness, but Caleb heard it all as if from a distance. "I didn't expect you in town," she said. "Neither did I." She looked at him more closely then. "Is something wrong?" "Yes," he said, "I've been a fool." A faint crease appeared between her brows. "That is not precise enough to be useful." Despite everything, that nearly undid him with affection. "Then I'll be precise." He stepped onto the boardwalk. "I don't want you to take that room." She went very still. "Caleb, I know what I said when winter started. I know the arrangement. I know I've given you every reason to think I meant to keep things exactly as they were." He drew one breath, then another, because this part had to be spoken whole. "But they are not as they were." Eliza's hand tightened on the parcel. He went on, low and steady. "When you came to my door, that house was a place I slept in, nothing more. I kept it standing because work is easier than grief and silence is easier than wanting. Then you walked in with soot on your dress and asked for work, and somehow there was bread on the table again, and lamp light in the front room, and laughter where I had not left space for any. You made the place feel lived in before I knew I wanted that. You made it feel honest." Her eyes had filled, though she said nothing. I was frightened by how much it mattered, frightened because loving again felt like stepping against the memory of everything I buried. His voice roughened, but he did not stop. I know better now. You did not take anything from what came before. You showed me I could carry it and still live. The parcel slipped a little in her grip. He took one more step, enough to close the distance if she wished it closed. I love you, he said, and I am afraid. Both things are true. I love you, and I am afraid of losing you, and I am more afraid still of letting you go because I was too much of a coward to speak. For a heartbeat, the whole world seemed to wait on the boardwalk with them. Then Eliza let out one unsteady breath. You stubborn man. It was not refusal. He almost laughed from sheer relief. That has been said of me. She set the parcel down on the bench beside the window, as if her hands needed freeing for what came next. When she looked at him again, there was grief in her face, and tenderness, and something clearer than either. I have loved you for some time, she said, not because you rescued me, not because I needed saving. I loved you because you are decent when no one is looking, because you kept giving care names other than care, because even in sorrow you never tried to own what was not yours. A tear slipped free, and she did not wipe it away. But I would not beg to be chosen, Caleb. I have buried too much for that. You never should have had to. No, she shook her head slightly. I should not. He swallowed. Then don't beg, just tell me if there is still time. A soft, incredulous smile touched her mouth. You rode all the way into town to ask me that. Yes. You might have said it over supper. I might have choked on the potatoes. That won a laugh from her, wet and warm at once. She stepped closer then, close enough that the front of his coat brushed her sleeve. There is still time, she said. He reached for her carefully, giving her the chance to step back if she wished. She did not. His hands settled at her waist, familiar now from a dozen practical steadinesses and wholly altered by this one. Her own rose to his chest, resting there as though they had always known the place. When he kissed her, it was not with urgency, but with a kind of reverence that surprised him. Slow, certain. The kiss of a man who had finally stopped fighting the truth long enough to honor it. Eliza answered in the same spirit, her mouth soft beneath his, her fingers curling lightly in his coat. Somewhere behind them, the store door opened and shut again very quietly, followed by the muffled sound of Mrs. Penny scolding someone to keep walking. They drew apart only enough to look at one another. Well, Eliza said softly, that is likely to become town business before sundown. Then let them have something worthwhile to discuss. She smiled fully then, and the sight of it, clear, unguarded for him, struck him deeper than the kiss itself. She did not take the room above the milliner's shop. Instead, by mutual agreement and much whispered interest from the town, she remained where she had first intended only to winter, not as a boarder any longer, not as a temporary arrangement held together by weather and caution. By late April, after the roads had dried enough for proper travel, Caleb drove her into town in the wagon and bought the pale blue curtain cloth himself, because she said the front room deserved better than bare panes now that it had learned how to welcome daylight. He also built shelves in the small back room for her sewing, though she insisted he set them too high and had to make him move the middle one lower. Mrs. Penny sent over a proper work table as a wedding gift before there had been any formal wedding announced. Daniel arrived with a new kettle and the expression of a man far too pleased with his own foresight. The proposal, when it came, did not happen under moonlight or in the middle of some grand view. It happened in the kitchen one ordinary evening while Eliza was rolling out pie dough and Caleb was standing uselessly nearby with a sack of flour he had already been told twice to put down. "Will you marry me?" he asked, "or shall I go on blocking the light until you answer from sheer annoyance?" She looked up, hands dusted white, and said, "That depends. Are you going to keep pretending help means standing in doorways?" "I can improve." You had better." Then she set down the rolling pin, stepped into his arms, and said yes against his shoulder. They married in June under clear skies behind the church, with Reverend Cole officiating and half the town pretending not to cry. Eliza wore a simple dove-gray dress of her own making with cream trim at the cuffs. Caleb, who had faced blizzards, livestock injuries, and 3 separate creek floods with less visible strain, nearly failed to speak the vows for the tightness in his throat. Daniel stood beside him grinning like an idiot. Mrs. Penny had decorated the church steps with jars of wildflowers and claimed afterward that she had not done any such thing, though no one believed her. Married life did not transform them into different people. That was not its gift. Its gift was simpler and better. It let them be fully themselves without fear of what that might cost. Caleb still rose early and spoke less than most men. Eliza still rearranged rooms toward usefulness and regarded his notion of good enough as a private insult to the Creator. They disagreed over where boots ought to be left, how much salt belonged in beans, and whether the old hound should be allowed beneath the kitchen table in bad weather. Yet even their differences became part of the house's warmth. The front room no longer sat dark through evening. The stove stayed lively. Her sewing brought women and children to the porch at respectable hours, and once Caleb, coming in from the pasture, found 3 girls in plaits perched at the table while Eliza taught them hemming, and the hounds slept under all their feet like a weary schoolmaster. He paused in the doorway. One of the girls looked up. "Mr. Harlan, Mrs. Harlan says your cuffs are scandalous." Eliza did not even glance over. "They are." Caleb set down his hat. "Then I suppose I'd better continue disgracing myself where I can be seen." The girls giggled. Eliza's smile followed him to the wash basin. Seasons turned. The ranch prospered better than it had in years, not from luck, but because hope is a more useful companion than grief when there is work to be done. The west pasture was reseeded. A lean-to was added near the barn. Eliza took on enough sewing to justify the sign Daniel painted for the road, EHALAN, mending and fine stitching. She said the sign was too large. Daniel said her modesty was poor for business. Caleb, with the loyalty of a husband and the prudence of a man who preferred peace, declined to take sides. When their daughter was born the following winter, the whole town seemed to take it as confirmation of something they had already known, that the house on Caleb Harlan's land had been waiting for life all along. They named her Anna June, the first name Caleb had spoken with trembling honesty to Eliza on that rainy night. The second for one of the little girls Eliza had lost to the fire. Neither name erased the dead. Together they honored them. That mattered. By then the house had changed so thoroughly that only its bones remained the same. The empty chairs were empty no longer. One was Caleb's by the stove. One was Eliza's at the sewing table. One, smaller and perpetually crooked because a child never sat straight, belonged to Anna June, who learned early to bang spoons on wood and laugh when the hound barked back. The front windows wore blue curtains that moved softly in summer air. Dried herbs hung near the pantry. Boots crowded the mat by the door in numbers Caleb once would have called untidy and now counted without complaint. On certain evenings, after supper and before the lamps were turned low, Caleb would stand in the doorway between kitchen and front room and simply look. At Eliza bent over some small seam while the baby slept in a basket nearby. At the dog snoring by the stove. At the lamplight resting gold across the table where once he had sat with a dead fire and a tin cup, thinking silence was the nearest thing to safety he could hope for. Once, finding him there, Eliza asked, "What is it?" He crossed the room and kissed the top of her head before answering, "Nothing's wrong." "That is not what I asked." He smiled then, the full kind now, no longer rare enough to startle him. "I know, I was just thinking the house sounds different than it used to." She glanced toward the sleeping child, then back to her stitching. "Louder." Better. Her hand stilled. She looked up with the same warmth that had first unsettled his ordered life and then redeemed it. Yes, she said, it is. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods and on across the dark pasture. Inside, the fire held steady, the baby breathed softly, and the woman he loved sat beneath his roof with her work in her lap and peace in her face. It was not a grand ending. It was more precious than that. It was a life. If this story stayed with you, ride with us again. Subscribe and help keep these frontier tales alive for the next firelit night. Because out here, every name has a past, every trail has a cost, and every sunset still remembers. Until next time, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.